We live in a time where the pressures of the underserved and the poor have been greatly stressed due to the challenges and toil that COVID and the variants have taken on our society and our personal, local, and national resources. But it is times like these that test whether we live up to Christ's works to look out for the least in our society. In our epistle from James, the author makes a point that the church should not be blinded by glitz and glitter of the well-to-do and the well-being, but make a point to devote its resources to help the poor. Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In God's Politics, Jim Wallis describes an experiment a seminarian once conducted. The seminarian cut every text about the poor out of an old Bible. It took him, as Wallis reports, a very long time. And when the seminarian was concluded with his cutting, and he made all those editorial cuts, the old Bible could hardly hold together. It was all sliced up. It was literally falling apart. What we have done to create a Bible full of holes, he said. It's an evocative word picture of a holy Bible without reference to the poor as a book that is so holy that it can hardly hold together. Yet even the most faithful Christians have always found it tempting to gut our scripture in ways similar to the seminarian, but naturally overlooking God's stated concern for the poor, the outcast, the sick and the foreigner, the immigrant, and the stranger. We essentially cut out the Bible's call to care for people who are marginalized and in need. While God has a special concern for the poor, James chapter 2 suggests that Christians to whom it's written have an opposite preference. They are charmed by the gold and silver of the wealthier congregants. It's an age-old story. James wrote his epistle because the early church was struggling for identity. It's not surprising that many of the churches which James was writing continue to mirror the Roman Empire society around them. And that society showed distinction between the haves and the have-nots. It's a distinction as old as time. Cater to the well-to-do, ignore the rest. The passage before us today, James introduces us to a group that seems to be equivalent to our modern middle class. They're not rich. The rich are those who attend and they're trying to get their attention. They're not really poor. The poor also attend, but they are being ignored. They're somewhat in between, a kind of bell curve group that represents the broad middle. Sound familiar? In other words, there are people like us. So these in-between people are gathering for worship. They're giving special attention to the wealthy members of their congregation. James doesn't tell us why they are showing favoritism, but we can guess. Maybe they're hoping for a business deal. Maybe they're hoping to improve their social status. Maybe they want to keep better company. And maybe they're just schmoozing. Or maybe, just maybe, they recognize that to meet the needs of the larger community, they need to have some benefactors, some folks who can provide the financial support to get it done. It's a reality. The pandemic has caused much hardship in churches and those who attend them. The longer this pandemic goes on, the more uncertain the future of some of those congregations. It is interesting to note that some of the megachurches that ascribe to the prosperity theology are doing rather well, or at least their pastors are doing well. One Nigerian evangelist, mega pastor, has just purchased his 4th plane. Obviously, 3 were not enough. The prosperity gospel reduces God to a kind of cosmic bellhop, attending to the needs and desires of the creation. According to prosperity theology, faith is an anthrocentric spiritual force directed at God. Indeed, this theology views faith solely for material gain rather than acceptance of a heavenly justification. God is a heavenly slot machine. Just pull the lever. For most of us, our faith in God is based on an unconditional trust relationship between God and us. God is with us through this pandemic. God gives us comfort and encouragement. Thanks be to God. James' challenge to his early community clearly names God's preferential option for the poor. It's not simply an admonishment of the rich. It's an age-old scriptural identity. But that's not the primary issue for James. No, the problem with him, it's favoritism. James challenged to those who choose to associate with the rich at the expense of the poor. What James' listeners had fallen prey to is this dynamic that we're all too human about. When resources are scarce, when the future is uncertain, when the enemies are at the gate, we find ourselves trying to hedge our bets, to try to persuade or curry favor from those of means, even if the folks have beaten us down in the past. When money is tight, when it seems foolish to ask if we stand with the poor because it is among them that we are called to show mercy and compassion, what do? It's a far more rational stand to be and take a position with those of means, knowing that the financial viability depends on their patronage, that we may not be able to provide and support for the needs of the poor and others unless we get it from those with more means. So this is James' call to us, not simply to critique the rich or those who are well-to-do or influential, but to emphasize with the poor, the marginalized, the underserved. We're called to stand in what Parker Palmer calls the tragic gap, the space between what is and what should be, the place between rich and poor, the place between the privileged few and the alien masses. It is the place where we are called to stand. It is the place of the cross. James invites us to examine our relationships with one another and our willingness to put our faith to work. Now, James makes his point using a hypothetical example. The entrance in the community gathering for the rich, a gold-ringed man, shiny clothes, etc., someone who's privileged comes in, and then someone who's destitute with filthy clothes. If the people treat them differently, such as the former being given a seat of honor and the latter told to sit off to a side or at a step stool, that's where James comes in and castigates this kind of discrimination. He warns them. And James reminds all of us what we say at Pilgrim Church every morning. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and with all your mind and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. This is the heart of what he's trying to remind the church. James invites us to reflect on what it means to love our neighbors, especially those who are less fortunate than ourselves. James further challenges us to examine how we treat marginalized persons with less social power, such as refugees, immigrants, children, people of color, and the LGBTQA people. It seems that James encourages us to treat all people with respect and dignity, without regard of race, color, religion, or national origin. He reiterates that there is just consequences for treating others mercilessly. And that our response should be mercifully towards the merciful, an association that echoes the Sermon on the Mount. And so here we are challenged to consider what factors, what actions we're to make to make this faith visible, put this faith to work. Our faith in action. This is what James is talking about. He challenges us to consider how we live our faith together and live it in ways that reflect God's mercy and the benefit of the marginalized. Some of the hardest working people are the working poor. Barbara Ehrlich has made a career as a writer, author of dozens of books. In her bestseller, Nickel and Dimed, on Not Getting By in America, she describes how for 6 months she lived a life of an unskilled but fully employed wage earner. In Florida, she worked as a waitress from 2 to 10 p.m., and then as a house cleaner or molly maid. In Maine, she worked as a dietary aide in a nursing home and a hotel maid. In Minnesota, she clerked at Walmart. Erin Rick lived in budget hotels, in dangerous trailer parks, and ate only what she could afford, which tended to be fast food. And she discovered that she needed 2 unskilled jobs just to squeak by, and overall found herself physically and emotionally drained. And God help her if she ever got sick and needed health care. The statistics show that the poor and the less affluent are dying of COVID at the rate of 120%, 127% over those with resources. The unskilled wage earners like that Eric portrays constitutes about 30% of the American workforce, and they earn roughly $5.15 to $7 an hour. Most not even minimum wage. And they're trying to make their way in America, trying to live some sort of an American dream. Do we see these people? Or do we just overlook them? They clean our offices and buildings at night. They serve us at restaurants, repair our cars, handpick our fresh produce, and blow our suburban yards. They work long and hard, and yet they barely make ends meet. On this Labor Day weekend, we are mindful that the medium state minimum wage worker would have to work 89 hours each week to afford a 2-bedroom apartment at 30% of his or her income. And that's the federal definition of affordable housing. In Chattanooga, some say we're a little better off, maybe because our manufacturing. The average hour wage in Chattanooga as of August 21st, 2021 is $12.86 an hour. Now, according to ZipRecruiter, it's $16.17 an hour. That includes all the manufacturing. Now, to afford a two-bedroom apartment in 2021 in Chattanooga, the average wage earner must make $16 an hour. And for those who need help, there are currently only 52 low-income apartments available for rent in all of Chattanooga. Can you imagine the waiting list? Christians should learn to lean in the favor of the poor, not because of any political agenda of right or left, but because we're called to imitate the character of God. Using a legal metaphor, Proverbs says that God is the maker of the poor, their advocate, their vindicator, who will take up their case. And James adds that God has chosen the poor to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him. But we're required, yes, required, to point out other distinctions that we are making in the lives of our church today. Fundamentally, it is the distinction between those like us and those who are not like us. And we give preferential treatment to those of our race, our gender, our orientation, and yes, our economic status. And in doing so, we're claiming that these others are not worthy of God's grace as we are. I'm thankful and hopeful that we, as pilgrims, understand this distinction and are making a concerted effort to treat everyone on this equal plane. It takes work. We're not perfect. But by God's grace, we'll get there. You know, for us in the US today, it's not hard to notice the impact of poverty on wealth. And poverty on the US as a whole. 60 million people have incomes below what was considered minimally adequate level. 60 million. And here in Tennessee, almost 15% of our residents live in poverty, capital P. And millions struggle. The poor are with us, they're around us. They wait on us in stores and restaurants, care for our children and our elders, wash our cars, manicure our nails, and clean our office buildings. And on this Labor Day weekend, this Sunday, consider some of the factors that workers and their families struggle against. I'm going to switch to hard copy since I'm freezing up here. So many of the poor are working too little to get out of poverty. Amongst the poor ages 18 to 64, a third are not available to work because they're sick, disabled, possibly retired, or something else. And the 2/3 who could work are looking for work. And in those who are looking for work are concerned about the COVID and the variants. And what are they going to do? And how are they going to provide for their families and keep them safe and healthy? More than 80% of low-wage workers don't have any sick days. Most don't even have health care. And so when they have to take a sick day, that means no money in their paycheck. So James warns us to pay attention. We're called to stand with our less fortunate neighbors. We're called to correct workplace abuses, to reform our labor laws, to support workers' rights, to form unions. And we need to stand with them, with all workers in their struggle for higher wages. All but 11 states have increased the minimum wage. Tennessee is one of those that has not. So many of our Tennesseans are struggling because of that. So James says it's not the wealth issue that he's condemning. That's just the outward manifestation, but it's a lack of compassion and understanding on the part of the wealthy and those who want to be or prefer to be towards those less fortunate. And the Old Testament repeatedly emphasizes that God is concerned for the rights of the poor.
Yes, that was a big one.
Queen Jezebel hired false witnesses to accuse Naboth and executed him. They seized his property just because her pouting husband Ahab wanted a vegetable garden. And the prophets often confronted Israel for opposing the poor, especially orphans and widows. After all, Sodom was condemned because she had arrogance, abundant food, careless ease, and did not help the poor and needy. And so at the end of our time, at the end of our days, when our time has come, what will the Lord say to us? Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in, naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And the righteous will answer to him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger, invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And he answered and said, truly I say to you, to the extent that you do this to the least of these of mine, you do it to me. I would like to close with a true story. Sandor Tesler knew that what it meant to stand in this tragic gap. As a Jew, Tesler left hungry for the United States after escaping from the concentration camp with his family in the early part of World War II. Trained as a textile worker, he made his way to Spartanburg, South Carolina. It's the center of the textile industry. In the 1950s, after Brown v. Board of Education, Tesler became anxious as he saw the rise and reemergence of the KKK, as he heard racist rhetoric around him and that it began to intensify. Sound familiar? He recognized it from his days in Europe, and he could not simply ignore this for the sake of business. So he went to his foreman and asked, where are the racial tensions most hostile in the area? And the foreman replies that he thought it was around Kings Mountain. Tesler built a factory in Kings Mountain. So when the word got out, the white mayor in Kings Mountain came to see Tesler and said, are you planning to hire white workers? Well, Tesler said, of course, I'll hire the best workers around. And if they're good enough, absolutely, I'll hire them. And shortly later, a black pastor from a large African-American church came to Tesler and expressed his hope that he would hire black workers. Again, Tesla encouraged him to find the best workers he could. And if they were good enough, he would hire them. And so in the end, he had 16 employees, 8 white, 8 African American. And the mill was in one room and had one bathroom, one set of showers, and one water fountain. And after the initial introductions of the tour of the plant, one white worker boldly asked, "Is this going to be some kind of integrated plant?" Tesla replied, "You are being paid twice as much as any other textile worker in the area. You can work with us here in the way we work, or you're free to go someplace else." Any other questions? There were none. All 16 stayed. And months later, as the plant had grown in production, such as a new group of employees were hired, after the tour, the same question was raised by another white worker. And the same answer was given. You're being paid twice as much. And if you don't like that, like our conditions, you're free to go elsewhere. Because Sandor Tesla dared to stand in the tragic gap, an entire industry was integrated. James called us not to choose between rich and poor, not to choose between black and white, not to choose between young and old, first world, third world, free or imprisoned, sick or healthy, naked and clothed, hungry and fed. In the end, these are all false dichotomies, for we are all children of God. James calls us to stand in the cross of Jesus Christ, to take up residence in the tragic gap between what is and what should be, and to profess a faith that stands anywhere else. That is to profess death. We are to stand with Christ, and we are to stand up and do what is right. Amen.